Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are opening a 19th century history book, but, we're really reading it through a modern geopolitical lens.
hmm
We are looking at a conflict that wasn't fought with missiles or nuclear silos, but was undeniably a global Cold War, played out across maps, fueled by paranoia, and executed by armies marching across the rugged, unforgiving terrain of Central Asia.
That is precisely right. We are diving into the First Anglo-Afghan War, 1839 to 1842. And this is a story of, well, catastrophic military failure, diplomatic arrogance, and how exaggerated fear can translate into ruinous policy.
Right.
To understand the war, however, we must first understand the stage. This intense, decades-long rivalry known to history as the Great Game.
So our mission today is clear. We are going to unpack that immense geopolitical rivalry between Britain and Tsarist Russia, analyze exactly how the fear of invasion led to a staggering military blunder, and perhaps most importantly reveal the true cost of these strategic blunders, a cost that was financially and humanly borne almost entirely by the people of India.
The Great Game. It's such a fascinating term. It sounds almost like a parlor pursuit, something you'd play on a board.
A gentleman's game.
Exactly. But in reality, it was a high-stakes, ruthless competition. This was the diplomatic, the political, and the covert military struggle between the British Empire, focused on maintaining its Indian jewel, and the Russian Empire, which was steadily, relentlessly expanding southward across Central Asia.
And the naming convention of this rivalry, I think it tells you everything you need to know about the two competitors' psyches, right?
It really does.
The British, viewing it perhaps with a mix of adventure, arrogance, and a stiff upper lip, they dubbed it the Great Game.
While the Russians, who were perhaps a bit more pragmatic about the shadowy maneuvering, they understood it as something darker, something more clandestine. They called it the Tournament of Shadows.
Tournament of Shadows, that's fantastic.
It was a multi-generational struggle for influence and control over the vast spaces separating these two colossal empires, where Central Asia became, the primary arena of operation.
But when we analyze the British impetus for action, their motivation, it all circles back to one singular, overwhelming anxiety. The British didn't engage in this game for fun. They engaged because they were utterly consumed by the fear that Russia was aiming directly at the most valuable piece of real estate on the planet, British India.
This is the core engine of the conflict. It's so important to get this. British officials in London and in Calcutta, the Governor-General's seat, they operated under the fundamental, unwavering belief that Russia was the existential enemy.
Not just a rival, but an existential threat.
An existential threat. So every subtle movement, every treaty signed by Russia with the Central Asian Khanate was interpreted as a calculated step in a grand strategy to destabilize or conquer India. That pervasive anxiety was not just background noise, it was the policy driver.
I see.
It explained and justified the aggressive, the preemptive actions that ultimately led to disaster.
Okay, so let's unpack that fear, because it really forms the foundation of the invasion. We need to detail why Afghanistan became the focus of this Russian scare. What did the British strategists believe made this mountainous region so crucial to the defense of India?
Well, the focus on Afghanistan was geographically deterministic, though you could argue it was historically debatable.
How so?
The British intelligence and strategic thinkers of the time, they held this deep-seated, persistent belief that Afghanistan constituted the only viable entrance to India from Central Asia. They looked at the maps. They believed that the vast deserts and mountains to the east and west were simply impassable for a major army.
So any Russian force attempting a southern invasion had to pass through the passes of Afghanistan.
They had to. That was the conviction.
So in their strategic maps, Afghanistan was seen as the literal gateway, or maybe more accurately, the choke point.
The choke point, exactly. If this choke point fell under Russian influence, then India, with all its wealth, taxes, and soldiers, was immediately vulnerable.
And that kind of thinking, that fuels a certain kind of policy.
It fuels what we can only describe as immense institutional anxiety. And that level of anxiety in the eyes of the British establishment, it justified any aggressive, preemptive action they might take to secure that gateway. They were willing to launch a war thousands of miles from their main center of power based on a perceived threat that was arguably geographically remote.
And what's so interesting is how they framed the narrative to justify this intervention, not just to themselves, but to the public back home. This wasn't just about territory. It became this big ideological confrontation.
It absolutely transcended mere border disputes.
Yeah.
The British establishment deliberately framed the Great Game as a Cold War between incompatible political systems. It was a very clever bit of branding.
So you had democratic Britain on one side.
On the one hand, you had democratic Britain representing liberty, commerce, and modernity. And on the other, you had autocratic Russia representing despotism, feudalism, and this sort of backward expansion.
And that elevates the whole thing.
It does. It elevates the conflict from a territorial safeguard to a struggle for the future of civilization itself, which makes intervention a moral imperative, in their view.
That sounds like brilliant, if, incredibly aggressive propaganda. You need a big, scary story to sell a hugely expensive war in a place most Britons couldn't even locate on a map.
And that's where key political figures stepped in. You had statesmen like Lord Palmerston, who was immensely influential, and he actively popularized and pushed the idea of the Russian peril.
The Russian peril.
Yes, this was the core narrative used to sell aggressive strategies, particularly the idea of moving borders forward to Parliament and to the British public. They used the specter of Tsarist conquest to secure the massive funding and political will needed for large-scale military intervention in Central Asia.
So this institutional anxiety, it's stoked by politicians, it's justified by this unique geographical view, and it eventually culminates in the panic of the 1830s.
That panic was the fuse. It led directly to the decision to launch the First Anglo-Afghan War, a war that ultimately ended in total humiliation.
But, and this is where we connect the dots to the long term, the strategic blunder of the First War did not cure the anxiety.
No, it intensified it. In fact, to regain the lost prestige and repair the profound blow to the British Indian Army's reputation, they felt compelled to double down strategically.
And you're talking about the subsequent rapid annexations of neighboring territories.
Precisely. We see the aggressive annexation of Sindh in 1843 and Punjab in 1849. Now, these were not defensive maneuvers against Russia directly. They were acts of political recovery.
Recovering face.
Purely. The disaster in Afghanistan forced the British to annex territory closer to the frontier, pushing British India's border right up against the mountains. And this established the permanent and costly need for a scientific border that was directly contiguous with Afghanistan, locking them into that forward policy mentality forever.
That's a profound strategic paradox. Failure in one region leading to aggressive expansion elsewhere, all done under the guise of restoring reputation. Let's dig deeper into the actual strategies being debated before Auckland made his fateful decision. The central question was, how should Britain secure its immense Indian border against this perceived existential Russian threat?
The debate was fierce, and it often reflected the political divisions back in London. You had two main strategic approaches vying for dominance within the East India Company and the British government.
Okay, let's start with the one that ultimately led to war, the forward policy. This was the more aggressive, the interventionist approach.
Indeed. The advocates of the forward policy, often associated with the conservative-leaning officials, argued for active control. They completely dismissed the idea of relying on diplomacy or, local strength.
So their position was what, essentially?
Their position was clear. Afghanistan was too important to be left to its own devices. They argued Britain must either conquer it outright, which was probably too resource-intensive, or, the slightly more palatable option, turn it into a completely controlled buffer state.
A buffer state designed not just to sit there passively, but to actively absorb a Russian attack before it could ever touch India.
Exactly. The forward policy was based on military preemption and political manipulation. It required installing a reliable, fully subservient ruler, a puppet, who would manage the region entirely according to British instructions. They wanted a secure, westernized, and friendly regime in Kabul, managed from Calcutta.
And what was the more sophisticated, less intrusive alternative? The one they called masterly inactivity.
That phrase, masterly inactivity, I love it. It sounds like a contradiction in terms.
It does.
But it was advocated primarily by liberal strategists. It argued for a policy of watchful non-intervention. And their argument was actually quite logical. Military campaigns deep into Central Asia were prohibitively expensive, logistically complex, and dangerously likely to inflame local populations.
So what did they suggest instead of marching armies into the mountains?
They favored diplomatic engagement, both with the local Afghan emir and, crucially, with Russia itself. They believed in defining explicit spheres of influence through treaties with St. Petersburg, establishing a diplomatic cordon sanitaire.
And what about on the ground?
Furthermore, they suggested a policy of subsidizing local Afghan rulers to encourage them to resist foreign encroachment rather than trying to rule them directly.
They saw entanglement in Afghan tribal politics as a quick path to a costly quagmire.
It sounds like a remarkably prescient argument given what followed. Yet, the forward policy won the day in the late 1830s.
It did, largely because anxiety trumped reasoned caution. But as we mentioned, the aftermath of the First War actually reinforced the forward policy, even when it was supposed to be discredited. The annexations of Sindh and Punjab are prime examples of this.
Let's expand on that connection. Why did regaining prestige require annexing Sindh and Punjab? It seems like a leap.
The retreat from Kabul in 1842 was an absolute world-class humiliation. It signaled weakness to every native prince and rival power across Asia. The immediate need, therefore, was to send an unmistakable signal of strength.
A show of force.
A massive one. Annexing two powerful, proximate, and rich territories, Sindh and Punjab demonstrated that British military power was undiminished and that its will to expand was absolute. It was a message.
And strategically, by absorbing those territories, they moved their frontier right to the Khyber Pass region.
Precisely. They established a logistical basis for what they call the scientific border. Now, this wasn't just a political boundary on a map. It was a strategically defensible frontier, backed by railroads and military garrisons, placing them in direct, permanent contact with Afghanistan.
So the failure in Kabul led them to conclude not that they should stop expanding,
But that they hadn't extended far enough to secure their flank. It was a costly and bloody correction driven by wounded imperial pride.
Okay, let's move now to the precise diplomatic failure that triggered the invasion. We know the British wanted a puppet king, Shah Shuja. But the ruler on the throne, Dost Muhammad, he initially offered them everything they wanted.
He did. And this is the great tragedy of the whole affair. Dost Muhammad was an energetic and capable emir. Here is the nuance often missed. In the 1830s, his primary concern was the Sikh Empire under Ranjit Singh, not distant Russia.
His problem was on his eastern border, not his northern one?
Yes, he genuinely saw friendship with the British, the powerful neighbors of the Sikhs, as his best defense. He was actively pro-British, even sending a formal friendly letter to the new Governor-General, Lord Auckland.
So if he was already friendly and willing to cooperate, what was the deal breaker? Why did it all go so wrong?
He had one condition, but it was existential for him. He needed British diplomatic and military help recovering Peshawar. Peshawar was critical. It was a strategic city and a vital entrance point to Afghanistan, which had been seized by Ranjit Singh's Sikh forces. For Dost Muhammad, recovering Peshawar was a matter of national security and, crucially, domestic legitimacy. He could not appear weak in the face of the Sikhs.
And this is where Lord Auckland, the Governor-General, commits what history deems a monumental strategic blunder, cloaked in this kind of diplomatic pretense.
Auckland flat out refused. His official moralistic justification was that the British Empire would not interfere in the affairs of independent states, meaning he wouldn't interfere in the relationship between Afghanistan and the Sikh Empire, which was a British ally at the time.
The hypocrisy is staggering, especially when you consider the strategic context. Ranjit Singh was a powerful ally they desperately needed to keep happy, and Auckland clearly prioritized that immediate alliance over securing the long-term buffer state.
He made a choice based on immediate expedience, a very short-sighted choice. By refusing to pressure the Sikhs, Auckland signaled to Dost Muhammad that Britain was not a reliable ally and would sacrifice Afghan interests for its own.
And that completely undermined Dost Muhammad's position.
Completely.
Yeah.
It undermined his ability to maintain his pro-British stance domestically. He was left with no choice. If the British wouldn't help him secure his eastern border, he had to look elsewhere.
And elsewhere meant turning to the one power the British feared most, Russia.
Yes. Rejected by the British, Dost Muhammad turned to Russia out of genuine geopolitical necessity. He wasn't ideologically pro-Russian, he was strategically desperate.
This sets the stage for the famous, or perhaps infamous, Burns mission of 1837. Captain Alexander Burns, a noted explorer and intelligence officer, was dispatched to Kabul.
Burns' mission was classic great game espionage. Officially, he was there to open up trade routes along the Indus.
Right, the cover story.
The cover story. Unofficially, he was a spy, tasked with gauging the sincerity of Dost Muhammad's alignment and the reality of the Russian presence.
And what did Burns, the man on the ground, actually report back to Calcutta? Did he see a Russian stooge?
No, quite the opposite. Burns' assessment was incredibly nuanced and ultimately completely ignored by Auckland. Burns confirmed that Dost Muhammad was, in his own words, English in views, genuinely preferring the British alliance. However, Burns also reiterated that the emir was absolutely non-negotiable on regaining Peshawar.
Burns explicitly advised Auckland, if you want Dost Mohammed as a loyal ally, you must facilitate the return of Peshawar.
So the man closest to the situation provided the solution, a diplomatic compromise, which Auckland, blinded by fear and prioritizing the Sikh alliance, promptly rejected.
Auckland's response was an impossible ultimatum, demonstrating an almost arrogant misjudgment of Afghan sovereignty. The message delivered back to Kabul was blunt. Thus, Mohammed must immediately drop all claims on Peshawar, and he must immediately cease all communication with Russia.
That was a political non-starter. He demanded total submission without offering any strategic benefit in return.
It sealed the failure. The diplomatic mission collapsed. Burns left Kabul, disappointed and warning of the consequences. And as soon as the British representative departed, Dost Mohammed warmly welcomed the Russian ambassador who was waiting in the wings.
Wow.
This failure, driven by Auckland's inflexible strategy and refusal to accept the reality of local politics, became the final, immediate trigger that convinced the Governor-General that diplomacy was dead and that only force could secure the gateway to India.
That failure, the combination of the deep-seated fear of Russia and the botched diplomacy of the Burns mission, convinced Auckland to abandon the cautious, masterly inactivity approach and embrace the full-scale forward policy. Let's discuss the decision to invade, the mechanics of the attack, and the initial deceptive success they found.
The decision was made to depose Dost Mohammed immediately. They basically labeled him a traitor or an unfriendly ruler. Auckland decided the only solution was to install Shah Shuja.
Right, the former ruler.
The previous ex-emir, who had been deposed 2 decades earlier and was currently living in British territory.
Why Shah Shuja? Was he particularly capable? Or popular?
Not at all. He was chosen precisely because he was weak and unpopular. The British leadership knew that Shah Shuja was utterly dependent on their bayonets to maintain power. He was the perfect puppet, a figurehead who would sign whatever treaties Calcutta demanded.
To launch this incredibly ambitious and risky operation, they needed a formal framework. This resulted in the Tripartite Treaty of 1838.
The Tripartite Treaty formalized the coalition between the British, their chosen puppet Shah Shuja, and the powerful Sikh ruler Ranjit Singh. This treaty was the logistical and political scaffolding for the invasion, allocating responsibilities and defining borders.
What was the motivation for Ranjit Singh, the Sikh ruler, to join a treaty designed to install a king in Afghanistan? It seems like he's inviting trouble on his own border.
Ranjit Singh was a very savvy ruler. He saw distinct advantages. Firstly, it legitimized his prior annexations, including Peshawar, which the British now formally accepted as part of his realm.
So he got what he wanted out of the deal.
He did. Secondly, he maintained a powerful buffer state between himself and the British, even though it was a puppet regime. And crucially, it meant that the dangerous, unpredictable task of marching armies through the Afghan mountains would be primarily borne by the British Indian Army, sparing his own forces. It was a classic, let the Allies do the hard work, strategic move.
With the treaty signed, the Army of the Indus was mobilized, a massive force of nearly 20,000 men and accompanying followers. The invasion itself, launched in 1839, was, at least at first, a military success.
Logistically, it was a marvel of imperial effort, though extremely costly. The army captured key cities like Kandahar and Ghazni rapidly. Dost Mohammed was indeed disheartened by the overwhelming show of force.
She didn't put up much of a fight initially.
After a brief attempt to rally resistance, he eventually surrendered to the British in 1840 and was sent as a state prisoner to Calcutta. Shah Shuja was installed on the throne in Kabul.
And at this point, in late 1839, the British declare mission accomplished. The forward policy has been executed, the puppet is in power, and the buffer state is secured. But this is where the plan immediately fell apart, because a king installed by foreigners with foreign money is not a legitimate ruler.
That is the crucial insight. Shah Shuja was not just unpopular, he was actively despised. He was seen as a relic of a bygone age, brought back by foreign infidels. He lacked any tribal support, any domestic legitimacy, and any genuine power outside the city limits of Kabul.
So it was a hollow victory.
The sources make it clear that the only reason he stayed on the throne was the massive, expensive, and increasingly arrogant British military occupation.
So let's detail that occupation period, because this is the phase between success and catastrophe that is often skipped, but which absolutely explains why the rebellion became inevitable. We're talking about the period from 1839 to 1841.
This period became a compound of folly, and it was fueled by British hubris. The British Residency, primarily led by political agent William McNaughton and the military commander General Elphinstone, they settled into Kabul with an attitude of complete superiority.
They got comfortable.
Very comfortable. They moved into these sprawling cantonments, military quarters, just outside the main city walls, neglecting to properly fortify them because they believed the Afghan population was completely subdued.
This sounds incredibly naive, especially given the history of Afghan resistance to outside rule.
It was worse than naive. It was strategically contemptuous. MacNaughton began acting less like a diplomatic agent and more like a viceroy, dispensing massive amounts of money and subsidies to keep powerful tribal chiefs in line. The British assumed that money could buy loyalty, replacing traditional Afghan structures with their own imported authority.
But that's a fragile system.
Dreamily.
So what was the immediate spark that turned that simmering resentment into open revolt?
It was a crucial, short-sighted financial decision. In 1841, London and Calcutta grew tired of the immense, ongoing expense of the occupation. It was bleeding them dry. So MacNaughton was ordered to drastically reduce the subsidies paid to the various tribal chiefs who controlled the passes and maintained the peace.
They essentially stopped paying the protection money.
Exactly. When the payments were cut, the chiefs took it as a signal of weakness and disrespect. They saw it as the British reneging on their side of the bargain. Loyalty evaporated overnight. The result was instantaneous. The tribal chiefs who controlled the critical lines of communication and supply, the passes leading out of Kabul, all rose in revolt.
That administrative blunder, driven by budgetary concerns back home, immediately activated the resistance that had been simmering for 2 years.
The uprising began small, but it erupted into a full-scale organized rebellion in November 1841. The sources describe this as a violent, complete reversal of fortunes. Within days, the British residency in Kabul was besieged.
And key officials were targeted.
Key officials, including Captain Alexander Burnes, the man who had warned Auckland not to interfere and to compromise over Peshawar, were among the very first high-profile victims, attacked and killed by the furious mob.
The irony there is it's thick. The man who argued for masterly inactivity is killed because the forward policy failed. And the British camps, those supposedly safe, expansive cantonments, were entirely unprepared for this.
They were caught completely off guard. The garrison commander, General Elphinstone, was old, he was ill, and by all accounts strategically incompetent. His forces were cut off from supplies and reinforcements. The rebellion became a siege, and the British position in Kabul quickly became untenable.
Now we move to the true catastrophe, the desperate negotiations and the horrific retreat in the snow, a moment that became a permanent scar on the history of the British Army.
The situation in December 1841 was desperate, utterly desperate. MacNaughton, the political agent, attempted to salvage the situation through negotiations with the primary Afghan leader, Akbar Khan, who was the son of the deposed Dost Muhammad.
What was MacNaughton even attempting to negotiate at this point?
He was trying to negotiate safe passage for the withdrawal of the remaining British forces. But crucially, he was simultaneously trying to bribe and double-cross Akbar Khan, offering him massive sums if he would switch sides.
So he was playing a double game?
And he was caught red-handed.
And his fate sent the final, brutal signal about how this was going to end.
MacNaughton was captured during the negotiation and brutally murdered, his body publicly displayed. This left the remaining demoralized British Command General Elphinstone with absolutely no leverage. They were forced to sign a devastation treaty with Akbar Khan, agreeing to an immediate and complete withdrawal from Kabul in the dead of winter.
They accepted a promise of safe passage, a guarantee that was completely worthless. Describe the retreat itself in January 1842. This was not a military maneuver. It was an extermination.
This is the legendary, tragic moment of the war. On January 6, 1842, the column began its march out of Kabul. It consisted of about 4,500 fighting soldiers, primarily Indian sepoys and some British regiments, but also a massive contingent of 12,000 camp followers.
12,000.
Yes. These are the cooks, servants, families, and tradesmen who accompanied the army. They were attempting to march 90 miles across the snow-covered mountains towards the British outpost at Jalalabad.
That is an immense number of non-combatants added to the disaster. What were the conditions they faced?
The conditions were nightmarish. The temperature was plummeting, the snow was deep, and they had limited supplies. The slow pace of the massive column, particularly the non-combatants, made them an easy target. Akbar Khan's promise of safe conduct was immediately broken. The column became trapped in narrow mountain passes, most famously the Kurd-Kabul Pass.
And the Afghan attacks were relentless.
The attacks were coordinated and brutal. Afghan tribal militias positioned high in the passes rained fire down on the struggling column. Soldiers, exhausted, freezing, and starved, could offer little resistance. The sources describe men fighting over scraps of food, throwing away their weapons because they were too weak to carry them, and falling dead from hypothermia in the snow.
The scale of the death is just horrific. 4,500 soldiers and 12,000 camp followers perished.
It was total annihilation. Only a handful survived captivity. In terms of those who escaped the passes and reached Jalalabad, the number is symbolic. One man. Surgeon William Bryden was the lone British survivor who made it to the relative safety of the garrison, confirming the extent of the massacre. The event became known in British history as the slaughter of the retreating army.
Unbelievable.
A complete, profound loss of life and prestige.
And the political symbol of the failure, Shah Shuja, came soon after.
Yes, the puppet king, he didn't last much longer. He was murdered in April 1842 by his own countrymen, effectively confirming that the entire premise of the war, installing a friendly regime, had utterly collapsed.
The war ended in defeat, but the British Empire cannot accept defeat without a response. Auckland was immediately recalled, and the focus shifted entirely to recovering face.
Lord Ellenborough replaced Auckland as Governor-General.
Right.
His mandate was singular and immediate. Restore British military prestige before finalizing the withdrawal. This was not about strategic game. It was about demonstrating that the British could inflict punishment and could not be defeated with impunity.
And this restoration took the form of brutal retaliation under a new force.
Forces were sent back into Afghanistan, what they called an army of retribution. They successfully recaptured Kabul and rescued the remaining British prisoners. However, the symbolic act of vengeance, aimed at signaling British power to all of Asia, was the deliberate destruction of the main Grand Bazaar of Kabul.
Why the bazaar?
This act was pure retribution, erasing a major commercial and cultural center before they finally pulled out entirely. It was a message.
So, after the vengeance was exacted and the prisoners were recovered, the strategic result of the entire 3-year, costly, bloody endeavor was what?
Zero. Absolutely zero. The British finally withdrew all their forces, and in the final ultimate strategic irony, Dost Muhammad, the very ruler they had deposed, imprisoned in Calcutta and fought a catastrophic war to replace, was released from captivity and immediately resumed his rule in Kabul.
It makes the Tournament of Shadows seem less like a game and more like a horrific waste. They spent millions of pounds, lost 16,000 lives, and reinstated the original ruler, proving that foreign intervention was pointless.
That sums up the immediate political failure. Now we transition into the critical evaluation of the long-term historical verdict on this entire affair, where we connect these disastrous actions to the wider imperial consequences.
Right, because historians have synthesized all these failures, the diplomatic arrogance, the strategic short-sightedness, and the military blunder into a single cutting descriptor.
They call the First Anglo-Afghan War a compound of folly, and that phrase captures the totality of the mistakes. It was arrogant because the British assumed their technological and military superiority allowed them to disregard local realities. It was ignorant because they failed to understand the fierce independence of the tribes and the importance of domestic legitimacy.
And the costs were staggering.
It cost an astronomical amount of money and profoundly, permanently damaged the reputation of the British Indian Army, particularly the prestige of the sepoys, who bore the brunt of the casualties.
Let's break down the failures further, starting with the moral dimension, which traces directly back to Auckland.
The moral failure is that the war was entirely unjustified on its own terms. Auckland violated the very principle he had used to refuse Dost Muhammad help with Peshawar, the principle of non-interference.
Right. His own stated policy.
He used the specter of Russian fear as a mask for naked aggression, invading an independent state whose ruler had initially sought his alliance. It set a terrible precedent for future imperial actions based on preemptive, exaggerated threat assessment.
And the political failure rested on two key strategic errors: the exaggerated Russian threat and the failure of the puppet king.
The fear of Russia was demonstrably overblown. Tsarist Russia was logistically incapable of launching a massive invasion across the thousands of miles of desert and difficult terrain that separated them from India in the 1830s. The immediate threat simply did not justify the scale of the invasion.
I am the puppet.
Furthermore, the goal of creating a permanent, compliant puppet regime failed utterly. The immediate and effective return of Dost Muhammad proved that legitimacy cannot be imported on the back of foreign soldiers.
But the failure didn't just stay contained in Afghanistan. As we discussed earlier, it had massive negative ripple effects that led to further conflict. The sources point specifically to the annexation of Sindh as a direct negative consequence.
This is a crucial piece of knowledge for you to understand.
The war machine needed continuous supply lines running from British India through the neighboring territory of Sindh and up into Afghanistan. To facilitate the movement of the Army of the Indus, the British consistently violated existing treaties they had with the emirs of Sindh, moving troops and supplies across their land without permission.
So they betrayed a long-standing ally purely for logistical expediency during the invasion.
Exactly. This betrayal and the subsequent encroachment created immense tension. Once the Afghan war ended in humiliation, the British desperately needed to assert dominance and recover prestige. The violation of treaties provided the political pretext, however thin, for launching another unjust war against Sindh in 1843.
And there's a famous quote that sums that up.
Charles Napier famously summarized the aggression when he allegedly said, "We have no right to annex Sindh, yet we shall do so, and a very advantageous, useful, and humane piece of rascality it will be."
That quote perfectly captures the cynical realpolitik of the era, acknowledging the moral bankruptcy while pursuing strategic advantage. So one act of folly led directly to another act of moral and military aggression against an unrelated state, simply to prove British power hadn't waned.
It connects the dots. The psychological need to recover prestige drove expansion more forcefully than the actual strategic need to secure the border.
And finally, we must address the true financial and human cost, which is often marginalized in the narrative of the Great Game. Who actually paid for the Army of the Indus and the resulting devastation?
This is perhaps the darkest aspect of imperial warfare. These immensely costly imperial expansion wars were fundamentally paid for not by the British Treasury in London, but entirely by the Indian Treasury.
Meaning?
That is, through massive taxes levied directly on Indian peasants, farmers, and citizens.
So the very people whose resources were being extracted to run the administration were also forced to finance the strategic blunders meant to protect the empire that governed them.
It is a devastating double burden. The financial cost was enormous, draining resources that could have been used for development within India. And the human cost was primarily borne by Indian soldiers, the sepoys of the Bengal Army, who formed the bulk of the fighting forces and the majority of the casualties, including those 4,500 fighting men who perished in the snow.
Here were the cannon fodder.
They were the cannon fodder securing England's strategic position in South Asia, dying for a policy driven by foreign anxieties thousands of miles away.
It underscores that imperial history isn't just a tale of two empires playing a game, it's a story of exploitation and outsourced conflict.
It reminds us that every strategic failure, every imperial blunder, always has a population that bears the unacknowledged financial and human burden.
Despite this horrific failure, the core strategic goal securing Afghanistan as a buffer state never vanished from the British imperial agenda. This eventually led, decades later, to the Second Anglo-Afghan War.
Yes, the British simply could not let go of the strategic necessity of controlling the Afghan foreign policy. The Second Anglo-Afghan War took place between 1878 and 1880, driven by a new viceroy, Lord Lytton, and a reignited anxiety over Russian advances in Central Asia.
So, rinse and repeat.
Essentially.
And did this second bloody attempt finally achieve the functional result they had sought for 40 years?
After more intense, costly fighting, it did. The Second War concluded with the Treaty of Gandamak. Now, this treaty represented a major strategic victory for the British. Under its terms, the Afghan emir retained internal sovereignty, but he formally conceded the right for the British to control his foreign policy.
A British agent in Kabul.
A British political agent was placed in Kabul to oversee this.
So, after nearly half a century, two major wars, untold financial expense, and the catastrophe of 1842, the British finally established the functional reality of Afghanistan as the buffer state they had desired all along.
The persistence was remarkable. The British proved that for them, the long-term strategic goal of securing India transcended initial failure. They were willing to keep paying the price until the outcome was achieved.
So let's bring this all together for you. We track the entire sequence, starting with the feverish anxiety of the Great Game, which led to a catastrophic overreaction. The First Anglo-Afghan War, a failure that was moral, political, and a profound financial burden borne by the Indian people.
The key takeaway is that strategic blunders are often magnified not by the initial defeat, but by the desperate psychological need to recover prestige. That imperial vanity demanded unjust annexations like Sindh and Punjab, perpetuating conflict in the region purely to demonstrate undiminished British might.
The lesson here seems to be that the emotional, prideful response to failure is often more dangerous than the original threat itself.
Absolutely. The British had to demonstrate they were not weakened by the slaughter in the passes, and that demand for proof created a cascade of subsequent conflicts.
That brings us to our final provocative thought for you to consider as you reflect on this deep dive. Despite the horrific cost, the vast human tragedy, and the total failure of the First Anglo-Afghan War, the British persisted across 4 decades until they finally achieved their desired strategic outcome, the compliant buffer state. This raises an important question about modern statecraft today. Is this long-term, expensive, even repeated pursuit of a desired geopolitical outcome, often after initial disaster, an inevitable characteristic of great power competition? Or is the story of the Anglo-Afghan Wars simply a tragic, repeated failure to learn from history, driven by an unchanging arrogance of power?
We'll leave that thought with you.
Yeah.
Until next time.